Good day. A short while ago, I did a program for this channel in which I discussed EU External Affairs Commissioner Josep Borrell's disastrous trip to Moscow on Friday, 5th February 2021. It might have been expected after this debacle that Borrell would want to move the subject on to other matters, but clearly angry and resentful at his treatment in Moscow, he has doubled down by an extraordinary blog piece which has now been published on the European Union's Europa website. This is a really remarkable blog piece because it exposes so vividly the extraordinary blindness of senior EU officials to much of the world around them and to the way in which their own actions and deeds are perceived. Now, I think the first thing to say about this blog piece is that in some respects it is clearly a defensive piece. It's obviously intended to explain or justify Borrell's very strange decision to go to Moscow empty-handed without any concrete proposals. That this is the case is shown by the last paragraph, which I will briefly read. Locking ourselves up behind walls and calling on others from the safety of that position will not bring greater security to the EU. And it is not in this way that I see my role as being the first diplomat of the EU. We have to face challenges, including meeting others in their home turf, just when negative events are unfolding, to allow us to better assess the situations we are confronting and the actions we should take. I prefer this to remaining reactive and waiting for things to happen. If we want a safer world for tomorrow, we have to act decidedly today and be ready to take some risks. Now, no one could dispute that. That is obviously correct. Borrell is absolutely right in saying that one should engage with the Russians or with other adversaries of the EU, including China and Iran or whatever country, and talk to them, and that means a readiness to go there and meet at their capitals with their senior officials. But here is the problem, because what did Borrell actually come to Moscow to do? And I'm going to say straight away that it is obvious when you read his blog piece that he came to Moscow with no concrete proposal at all, but instead with an intention of reading out a long lecture to the Russians about their misdeeds or alleged misdeeds. Here is what he says, and I'm reading it now again from his blog piece. The purpose of this mission was to express directly the EU's strong condemnation of events, and he's referring now specifically to the Navalny affair, and to address through principled diplomacy the process of rapid worsening of our relationship with Russia, and to help prepare the forthcoming European Council discussions on EU-Russian relations. Well, that's good enough. He comes along to make the EU's position clear and to find out what the Russians think. But what does he go on to say? What sort of points did he bring up? Well, first of all, he discusses at extraordinary length the Navalny affair, in which he takes an entirely rigid pro-EU position. Well, one would hardly expect otherwise at this stage, but then a responsible diplomat would know that the Russians are not going to move from their position on Navalny either. But then he goes on to discuss other topics. We also, I'm reading again from his blog, we also discussed conflicts in our immediate neighbourhood, and I insisted on the need to advance towards the full implementation of the Minsk agreement and on respect for Ukraine's territorial integrity. I argued as well the need to heed the call of the people of Belarus which has been loud and clear for 6 months now, to freely choose their president. Respect for the territorial integrity of Georgia, the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh, and the Syrian and Libyan crises were also among the issues which touched upon in a review of our troubled neighbourhood, where Russia and the European Union remain more often than not at odds. In discussing all of this, I stressed here there should be full respect for OSCE commitments, including respect for territorial integrity. Well, the problem here is that we see that Borrell is taking a rigid hardline position on all these topics. He must know, for example, that it was the Russians who largely drafted the Minsk Accord on Ukraine, and that it is Ukraine that has been slow-walking it. This has been openly talked about in parts of the Western media, and it is inconceivable that he doesn't know this. He talks about the need to heed the call of the people of Belarus. In other words, he is backing the protests there, seemingly oblivious to the fact that from a Russian point of view, that is open meddling in Belarus's internal affairs. But it's also the case, of course, that Belarus is a different country from Russia. So why is he bringing that topic up with the Russians? He then talks about respect for the territorial integrity of Georgia, which clearly refers to Russian recognition of the breakaway republics of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which following the crisis of 2008 seceded from Georgia and were recognized as independent countries by Russia and by a few other states. But here again, no recognition or awareness of the fact that the International Court of Justice, no less, has just ruled that it was Georgia that started the war, which led to these results, and not Russia. And then, of course, we turn to what he said about the Navalny affair. And here again, it's really striking to see what he had to say about this. He talks at length about Navalny. He also says that when it comes to Navalny, the Russians can't treat the Navalny topic as an internal affair because they have taken on certain human rights commitments, notably through their ratification of the European Convention on Human Rights. But Borrell doesn't speak for the Council of Europe, which is the body which administers the European Convention on Human Rights, and nor does he speak for the European Court of Human Rights, which actually decides whether there has been a violation of human rights or not. Also, and moreover, he overlooks the fact, or chooses to ignore the fact, that all the same points that he makes about Navalny, about violations of human rights and the rest, could be made back to him by the Russians, and apparently they were. Just for the sake of argument, I don't know whether or not this was said, it's entirely possible that Lavrov, in response to Borrell's comments about Navalny, would have brought up the issue of Spanish legal cases against Catalan political dissidents and the strong action taken by the Spanish government through the deployment of Spanish police to Catalonia to cancel the results of a referendum which took place there and to break up violently pro-independent protests that also took place there. Now, I'm not saying that Russians should have backed those protests or should have interfered in those affairs. On the contrary, I think they are an internal matter for Spain. But if that is an internal matter for Spain, it's not entirely surprising that the Russians would argue that the Navalny episode is an internal affair concerning Russia. I would add, incidentally, that Borrell is Catalan. Though he is actually aligned with the Spanish Socialist Party, not with the Catalan independence movement, but he is at least familiar with the events that took place in Catalonia, and as a supporter of Spain, presumably disapproves of the Catalan independence moves which took place there. Anyway, over and beyond all of that, we see how Borrell was also annoyed about the way in which the Russians responded to his lecture. He talks, for example, about an aggressively prepared news conference, aggressively staged press conference, which is indeed a press conference where he found himself facing all sorts of difficult questions and from the Russian media, who had clearly been primed to place them. But let us always remember that the Europeans often stage difficult press conferences for Russian officials. Russian officials often have to put up with difficult questions from Western journalists. There is no rule or principle which says that European politicians and European diplomats should also not face difficult and bruising encounters with Russian journalists. One would expect an official of the seniority of Borrell to brush off a difficult press conference and not sulk about it. Well, it seems that in Borrell's case, any critical treatment of him at a press conference is an act of gross lèse-majesté, and he is resentful and annoyed by it. But then finally we have the overall summary, and we see what Borrell has to say about the Russians. Firstly, it's quite clear that he was extremely annoyed by the Russian decision to expel 3 European diplomats who, the Russians say, attended pro-Navalny rallies. I would point out that according to the Russians, those rallies were held illegally, a fact which Borrell does not mention in his blog. He does say that the diplomats deny that they attended those rallies. Well, I'm not going to speculate about that. I would merely say that I presume the Russians have information which informs them otherwise. But anyway, here we come to what Borrell has to say. I returned to Brussels with deep concerns over the perspectives of development of Russian society and Russia's geostrategic choices. My meeting with Minister Lavrov and the messages sent by Russian authorities during this visit confirmed that Europe and Russia are drifting apart. It seems that Russia is progressively disconnecting itself from Europe and looking at democratic values as an existential threat. We are at a crossroads. The strategic choices we make now will determine international power dynamics in the 21st century, and notably whether we will advance towards more cooperative or more polarized models based on closed or on freer societies. The European Union can influence these developments, which requires a clear vision and objectives, accompanied by intense diplomatic engagement, supported by our many means of external action and projection of influence. Now, let's just pass some of this. Firstly, the extraordinary concern he expresses about the development of Russian society and Russia's geostrategic choices. Now that is code for reference to Russia's strategic partnership with China. And when he talks about Russia and Europe drifting apart and Russia disconnecting itself from Europe and looking at democratic values as an existential threat, we need to understand that he really means geostrategic choices. The European Union, in its own self-conception, is the embodiment of democracy. If you do not agree with the European Union, if you're making geostrategic choices to align yourself with a country like China, that means that you are rejecting democratic values. It is not an objective assessment of how democratic your country is or is not. It is a question of geostrategic choice. What geostrategic choice you make. If you are pro-China, you're anti-democracy. If you are pro-EU, you are pro-democracy. And that is all there is to say. So if you suppress protests in Catalonia, that is an act consistent with democracy. If you suppress protests in Moscow whilst aligning yourself with China, that is anti-democracy. It does come down very much to a question of geostrategic choice. But then, see the alarm. The strategic choices we make now, and when he says we, he means also the Russians, presumably, will determine international power dynamics in the 21st century. In other words, if Russia aligns with China, that will mean that an anti-Western, anti-EU bloc will start to emerge. And then he goes on to say that might decide whether we will advance towards more cooperative or more polarized models based on closed or on freer societies. Note again the words closed or freer, and talk about cooperative or polarized. Here we see coded language that clearly talks about a unipolar world based on Western values and Western ideas, and ultimately, it must be said, Western power counterposed against a multipolar or bipolar world in which there are various power centers, but also note the careful use of words closed or freer societies. Clearly, this is a reference to that famous book by Karl Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies, which has now become the Bible of the integrationist and globalist elite, of which, of course, Borrell is a member. From their point of view, any society that is opposed to those of the West is closed. Any society that is aligned with those of the West is free or open. That is clearly what these words mean. Well, I think that from every conceivable point of view, it would be better if the EU and Russia did indeed find a way of getting along better with each other. It seems to me that this conflict, this tension between the two, serves the interests of neither side. The Russians have said that, but the Russians have also made it clear that they're not prepared to sit back and be lectured by EU officials, or indeed Western officials, as if they are the naughty schoolboy and the EU or Western official is somehow a teacher who is delivering them a stern lecture about their misconduct. They are, in their own conception, the Russians, a great power and a civilization with deep roots. They have their own ideas and their own values, and if they're presented with lectures, they reserve the right to deliver lectures back in return. Western countries are quite free in expelling Russian diplomats. They never show the slightest concern about doing so. So it's not surprising that the Russians expel diplomats in return. Western countries jail people on various offences. There is a person in London, Julian Assange, who is currently in prison, though he is not guilty of any British crime, at the moment. He's not serving a sentence for any British crime of which he has been found guilty. And the decision to extradite him to the United States has been rejected by a British court. So the Russians would say, well, in that case, we are free in accordance with our own laws to jail someone like Navalny. Protests take place in Russia and they're broken up by the riot police. But if the Europeans want to bring that up, the Russians will, of course, bring up the fact that protests in Europe also take place and are also broken up by riot police. You don't have to agree with what either side is doing in relation to these matters to see that there is, in fact, more equivalence than Europeans and Westerners allow for. I'm aware of this point about whataboutism, but the Russians, needless to say, will simply say that hiding behind claims of whataboutism is self-serving and is intended to give the Europeans and the EU a free pass as they criticise them and in order to shield them from receiving similar criticism in return. The Russians won't do that, and they won't accept any lectures and statements made by Russian officials since Borrell's blog appeared has simply emphasised the fact. If the European Union is really concerned about the fact that Russia is indeed drifting away from Europe, is indeed becoming more distant from Europe, is indeed aligning more closely with countries like China and indeed Iran, then it needs to come up with concrete proposals to move things forward. Borrell came with no proposals to Moscow at all. He seems to have come with nothing that the Russians could use or which they could consider constructive. Lectures, stern lectures, get nowhere. Concrete proposals do. The Russians still say that the door is open, but after receiving and hearing comments like this from Josep Borrell, the day may soon come when that door is slammed shut. Thank you for joining me on this program. Please join me on more programs, both on this channel and on our other channels at the Duran. And also please look up Alex Christophorou's channel. You'll find links under this video. Please also look us up on our other platforms, BitChute, Odyssey, Library, Rumble, and the rest. Please also support us as you can through PayPal, Patreon, Subscribestar, and buy Bitcoin. And please, of course, check out our shop. The wonderful things you will find there are amazing magic mugs, our wonderful sweatshirts and t-shirts, long-sleeved and short-sleeved, our fantastic hoodies, our amazing hats. As I said on previous programs, viewers who buy things from our shop are thrilled by the quality of the products they find there, and you support our channel and our channels by actually coming and buying things from our shop. And of course, I look forward to you joining me in my next broadcast, and thank you for joining me today.